So I'm going to give you I think, pretty quick set of comments about the second piece of reading that we have from Hannah Arendt, because it's a short piece of reading. So, basic point, uh, once Israel was formed, which was 1948, it established as a one national objective to find and bring however many Nazis were possible to justice, to find the people that did this and to cause there to be an international tribunal where they'll be tried. And so Eichmann is captured in Argentina in 1960, and he's tried in 1961. Hannah Arendt, who we know as a political theorist and philosopher, was living in New York in the United States at this point, and she talked to the New York Times, asked them to let her report on this trial. Her idea was she wanted to go see what are these people like? What are these Nazis like? These people who killed all kinds of people that she knew and some of her relatives. So what's a Nazi really like? And the answer ends up being a relatively scandalous one. There are two things that she does that were scandalous, especially within Israel and within the American Jewish population. And this is that she says, oh, okay, so I went there to look at a Nazi, see, what does the face of evil really look like? And she was completely startled to find that, the face of evil looks just like regular people. It looks just like everybody else. So the subtitle of that book is an essay on the banality of evil. So banal means unremarkable, basic, normal, boring. Evil is basic, everyday, and boring. And so Eichmann had been an SS officer who oversaw transportation systems, taking Jews and gypsies and gay people and disabled people and Slavic people to the concentration camps where they were worked and then often systematically exterminated. So he was pivotal. I mean, anybody else could have done his job too, but he was the one that did it. He was pivotal in moving all these bodies to their death. And yet he didn't do it out of some grand sense of anger or racism or hatred. We picture Nazism, along with other hate crimes, etc., as being rooted in hate, some kind of actual personal, passionate reality, some kind of force that lives inside the evil person and just wants to kill others. This is how it shows up in movies. The Nazis are always like this in movies. Evil people in movies are often hateful people. But the scandalous thing that she says is like, well, no, actually, this grand evil, the most famous evil of the 20th century, of course, overlooking the Armenian genocide and the world wars themselves, and looking only on this portion of Germany's behavior. But this is the most famous instance of evil in the 20th century, and yet Arendt's claim is that this person, and perhaps by extension, many of the Nazis, most of the Nazis, were not particularly hateful, were not involved in these really nasty personal plans to destroy the Jews because the Jews are taking all our money and they're corrupting our society and all the kind of Nazi ideological stuff. And by the way, you want to think about ideology and understand why I'm concerned with ideology. Realize that when you look at ideology from a distance, it looks way uglier than when you're in it. So the Nazis had a huge propaganda machine. They had loudspeakers on all the streets in all the major cities that you could hear radio broadcasts of the Führer, Hitler. There was a very concerted effort to distribute propaganda about the legitimacy of the Nazi government, about the problem with the Jews, and so on. But though this ideology was in place, and perhaps it allowed Germans supporting the new regime, this revolutionary regime, right-wing fascist regime, the ideology facilitated their sense of normalcy. They're just doing the normal thing. But Arendt's point is that they were not guided by a deep sense of hatred. What guided them, and therefore what ultimately produces or composes evil on this grand scale, is not hatred, but conformity. It's, in the case of Eichmann, she tells this story, the section that I gave you is about the Pontius Pilate moment, where Eichmann was feeling troubled about the stuff that he saw going on, and this idea that like maybe we need to fix Germany by getting rid of all the Jews. This bothered him. because he wasn't a particularly hateful dude. Anti-Semitic to some degree. It's hard to find Europeans that weren't anti-Semitic to some degree, but not particularly motivated by that sentiment. It's not a deep core sentiment in Eichmann. His Pontius Pilate moment, the moment where he washes his hands, it's not his problem anymore, is when he gets to hang out at this gathering of very highly placed Nazi elite and German elite business people who cordially discuss the destruction of all the Jews, and then sit down and have a smoke and a drink and relaxing time afterwards. And once Eichmann, who was a sort of, like a smallish bureaucrat in truth, once he got to experience being with these important people, and he wasn't anyone, but these people were someone, Himmler and Heydrich, and he got to be around the actual leadership, and all of them seemed non-problematically committed to this course of action. And from that point forward, he just decided, it's not for me to decide. I'm not anybody special. I need to just do what the good people are already doing. Now that's a new definition of evil that Arendt offers us. And I think fairly compelling. It's not to say that there isn't hatred. It's not to say that Hitler wasn't a particularly hateful person. But it is to say that the fundamental force of evil, which Hitler freed and channeled and directed, was not ultimately the force of hate. It was the force of conformity. It was the willingness of regular old Germans to do what other Germans were doing. It was the willingness of soldiers to follow their orders without question. And ultimately in these trials, which are called the Nuremberg trials, or I guess the Nuremberg trials is the set before. In the Nuremberg trials, a principle is established, which is that a soldier can only follow ethical orders. If a soldier follows an order which is clearly unethical, then the fact that the soldier was just following orders is not a legal defense, according to the international standards developed in the middle of the 20th century. But this is what people do, and this is what soldiers do. So that's the first problem. She basically says, in the end, there's not anything that special about Nazism. It's got horrible dimensions. It was a form of totalitarianism. It sought to control whole populations, and largely on the basis of fear. But it's not really distinct from other forms of totalitarianism, like, say, the Bolshevik one, in this respect, and other people who are a bit harsher than Arendt, but who are a part of her same intellectual circle, Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Herbert Marcuse. They thought, even the West is really a set of new totalitarian mechanisms. They just work in slightly different ways, largely by means of media distribution. So, problem number one, Adolf Eichmann was just doing his job, and evil perhaps consists just in doing your job. This means, of course, that all kinds of people who were reading Arendt, they could get really upset. First of all, there is a community of Jewish people who have been very personally and directly impacted by this. Same thing as Gypsy people, and same thing for a lot of Armenians, especially in Los Angeles, right? Affected by large-scale genocidal maneuvers on the part of a nation-state. And they're ready to hate their enemy. And then Arendt shows up and she's like, well, what was wrong with the enemy is stuff that you're doing too. Just settling in and doing what those around you do, and following the recommendations of the allegedly good people in your community. When you see the good people do things, you figure it's got to be okay, and you just back it up right away. That's evil. So to go back to Thoreau, I think the largest point being made here, or the central feature of evil, is ultimately not hate. And when we get to Guevara, by the way, Guevara thinks that hate is necessary for good, even. But for Arendt, the centerpiece, the distinguishing factor of evil is not hate. It is thoughtlessness. It's conformity and thoughtlessness, the refusal to think for yourself, the refusal to take a stand on your own. This is the problem. And this means that the very people who wanted to think of themselves as good and the Nazis as evil, and simply to finally have a little bit of closure as some of the perpetrators of this grand evil are called to justice, instead of being able to understand themselves as just and as victims, the possibility is opened up that they can be considered unjust and perpetrators as well. Very unpopular position that Arendt takes. And, because we always want to turn our material into questions, the question is, do you think she's right? Might it not be that the most evil thing in the world is not hatred, is not a gas chamber in itself? It's the refusal of people to think for themselves, and their basically cowardly flight into doing what others say so that they will not have responsibility. The flight from responsibility. Just doing your job without having to think through what your job means. Perhaps this is the most evil thing. And then the other thing that Arendt did in this, what became a book that she wrote in reporting on the Eichmann trial, where she pointed out some details about the way in which the Nazi extermination machine worked that a lot of people didn't want to hear about. So, of course, the Nazis had the task, I guess these days you call it like a biopolitical task. They had to sort through the population. They had to find who the Jews were and get them to wear these armbands. And ultimately they wanted to extract Jews from different communities, pile them together, throw them on a train, send them off to their death. In the meantime, though, they were very careful and they were very concerned to take all their wealth. And one of the major things that the Nazis were up to with the Jews was seizing their wealth. All that money, all those houses, the personal effects, but then also the business holdings of large numbers of Jews passed direct into Nazi hands. Now, technically speaking, how were they able to do this? How did they actually go about identifying, finding, rounding up, robbing, and then putting people on trains where they are driven to their death? How did they do it? And the answer that Arendt gives is like, well, this is an ugly fact, but the Jews helped the Nazis do it. And not just any Jews, but the highly placed, prominent Jews. The ones who had made a name for themselves, were big property holders, were people holding respected positions within the community, rabbis, people of quality and character, people with aristocratic backgrounds. It's this small portion of the Jewish population that was courted by the Nazis. And what the Nazis did was they said, look, we're going to put you in charge of finding X amount of Jews, which is about what we think exists in this town. You got to find them. We want them delivered to us on a regular basis. We want you to use your police force, because oftentimes these people were in a position to command a police force, or the Nazis helped them establish one. You're going to use your police, your Jewish police, to go round up Jewish people, and you're going to bring those people to a gathering point, and you're going to take all their stuff and you're going to hand it over to us. You're going to look through all their paperwork, find out what holdings do they have, and you're going to hand that stuff over to us. And then you are personally going to put them on the train and send them off. The Nazis aren't going to do that. The Jews are going to do that. And of course, if you don't do this, you'll be on the train. And so a lot of highly placed, previously respected Jews took part in these so-called Jewish councils, which did the dirty work of the Nazis in a hands-on sort of way. And then, of course, this produces some really convoluted psychological effects, where the people who are involved in this atrocity liked to think that, okay, well, so the Nazis have put me in this position. If I don't do it, I'm going to be killed. My family's going to be killed, so that's kind of a no-brainer. But I can convince myself also that I'm actually doing something good, because I'm going to choose. Who'd they choose? Well, first of all, they'd choose people they never heard of. They chose poor people. They chose people they didn't know. They chose people of no substance, But once in a while, they were able to find somebody that they knew and cared about and save them and spare them in one way or another. And so they allowed themselves to believe that they were doing good, when in fact they were doing extreme evil. And what was that evil in that case? It was basically a form of cowardice. They were unwilling to risk themselves by refusing or by organizing to fight back against the Nazis. Now, Arendt writes about this, I think not in the portion that I gave you, but elsewhere in that book. She says, there were limited instances of Jewish communities organizing themselves to defend against the Nazis. And statistically, what happened was that in those areas, a smaller percentage of Jews were actually taken away and destroyed. So resistance actually would have worked better. But these Jewish councils were filled with people who, instead of choosing rebellion, instead of choosing armed resistance, they chose, a non-violent path, if you like. And this path amounted to their becoming an aspect of the Nazi machine. If we want to turn this stuff into questions, then the questions can be like, what work do you do? What work are you thinking that you'll do? What all systems? And these are very much the same questions that I asked about Thoreau, right? Because I think that Arendt and Thoreau are like kind of on the same page. The business that you want to go into, what all is it involved with? What does it support? What's its connection to the military-industrial complex? What's its connection to the prison-industrial complex? What's its connection to exploitation of workers? Do you think that what these businesses that you may be employed by, or that maybe you're already employed by, do you think that what they're doing is right? If it's not right, couldn't you find another job? Couldn't you really try and look for another job? Shouldn't you be taking a significant amount of your planning about where you're going? Shouldn't you be taking a good amount of your efforts in order to find businesses, industries, jobs, which are not as problematic as many businesses, industries, jobs are? Think about it another way. Is our government involved in evil somehow? I think the answer has to be yes. All the weapons that we're giving to Saudi Arabia, the use of those weapons by Saudi Arabia to bomb the hell out of Yemen, unconscionable, especially starting under Obama. The assassination programs. So the special forces are involved in a global network of assassination programs. The whole drone program, which largely got going started with Bush, but really happened more under Obama. Those are targeted murders. What about all the dictatorial regimes that the United States props up? Hugely non-egalitarian, non-democratic regimes. The military government in Egypt, the Saudi regime, Indonesia, Honduras, all over the place. Isn't our government engaged in evil? And then, if that's true, shouldn't we try to figure out how to withdraw ourselves from that? Maybe we should not pay taxes. Maybe we should rebel against that government. Maybe we should attempt to establish a new government. So I want you to think about this sort of stuff. And the last one, is it really true that the Nazis, I mean rank and file, everyday Germans who joined the Nazi Party, were they really any different than everyday Americans? Couldn't that same thing happen here? Maybe it is happening here. I would like to know what you think about this stuff. I want to inspire a habit of thinking, oh, this is an interesting book. Wait a minute. Doesn't this say something about my present?